Stillwater Springs, Colorado Territory, 1883. The dust from the cattle drive still clung to Flynn Garrett's clothes as he rode into town, his 24 years of life having already carved lines of determination around his eyes. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Stillwater Springs' Main Street as he guided his chestnut quarter horse toward the livery. 3 months on the trail had left him with a thick wallet and an empty heart. Flynn had long ago convinced himself that men like him, cowboys who followed the herds and slept under stars, weren't meant for settling down. The frontier was no place for love. It was about survival, hard work, and moving on before anyone got too close. He adjusted his worn Stetson, pushing back a lock of his sandy brown hair. The town seemed peaceful enough, but Flynn knew better than to trust appearances. 8 years of drifting had taught him that trouble could find a man anywhere, especially one who let down his guard. Better to keep to himself, collect supplies, maybe enjoy a hot meal and a bath, then be on his way. Attachments were dangerous out here, where death rode as close as a man's shadow. The livery boy took his horse with a nod, and Flynn stretched his lean frame, working out the kinks from the long ride. At 6 feet even, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, he cut an impressive figure despite the trail dust. A woman crossing the street caught his eye and smiled. Flynn tipped his hat politely but kept walking. Pretty faces were distractions he couldn't afford. "You stay in long, mister," the livery boy called after him. "Just passing through," Flynn replied, the same answer he'd given in a dozen towns across the territory. Just passing through, the story of his life. He headed toward the hotel, his spurs jingling with each step, unaware that this particular town would test his most deeply held conviction. That a man could only count on himself in this untamed wilderness. On the other side of town, in the modest dress shop where she worked 6 days a week, Harriet Turner bent over her sewing, nimble fingers working the needle through fine cotton fabric. At 20 years old, she had long ago accepted her place in Stillwater Springs' hierarchy. The shopkeeper's plain, unremarkable niece, the girl whose face wasn't quite pretty enough to attract suitors, whose figure was a little too thin, whose demeanor was far too bookish for the rough men of the frontier. "Harriet, I need those curtains finished before closing," called Mrs. Wilkinson, the shop owner. "Yes, ma'am, almost done," Harriet replied softly, pushing her wire-rimmed spectacles up her nose. The long brown hair she kept in a simple braid down her back was coming loose after hours of work. She tucked a stray strand behind her ear and returned to her stitching, ignoring the bell that announced new customers. It would be the Carothers sisters again, coming to collect their new Sunday dresses and to whisper behind their hands about poor Harriet, the girl everyone pitied but no one really saw. "Did you hear a new cowboy rode into town today?" One of the sisters giggled to Mrs. Wilkinson. "Handsome as sin, they say." "All you girls think of is finding husbands," Mrs. Wilkinson chided, though her tone was indulgent. Harriet kept her head down. New cowboys came and went. None of them ever looked twice at the quiet seamstress with ink-stained fingers from reading too many books. Her aunt and uncle had taken her in after her parents died in a fever epidemic when she was 12. They were kind enough, but they'd made it clear that her plain looks meant she'd need to rely on practical skills rather than the prospect of marriage. So she'd thrown herself into learning, sewing, reading, writing, mathematics, anything to make herself useful in a world that valued women primarily for their beauty. "Harriet, once you finish those curtains, you can go home," Mrs. Wilkinson said. "Your uncle wants you to help with inventory at the mercantile tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am," Harriet nodded, knowing that home meant the small room above her uncle's store, where she would spend the evening reading by lamplight, her one indulgence in an otherwise practical life. She finished her work as the sun began to set, packing away her sewing basket and donning her faded blue bonnet. The streets were busy with the evening crowd, men heading to saloons, women finishing their shopping. Harriet kept her eyes down, moving quickly toward the mercantile, when a group of rowdy cowboys leaving the saloon blocked her path. "Well, look here, boys, it's the bookworm," laughed one of them, a local ranch hand who'd taken to taunting her whenever their paths crossed. "Please excuse me," Harriet murmured, trying to step around them. "What's your hurry, Miss Turner? Got some important reading to do," another jeered. "Maybe you should put those books down and learn how to fix that face of yours." Cruel laughter followed as Harriet's cheeks burned with humiliation. She clutched her basket tighter and attempted to push past them, but one grabbed her arm. "Let's see what you're hiding under that ugly bonnet," he said, reaching for her head covering. "The lady asked you to let her pass." The deep voice cut through the laughter like a knife. Harriet looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man standing a few feet away. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could see the firm set of his clean-shaven jaw, the intensity in his green eyes as they fixed on her tormentors. "Mind your own business, stranger," the ranch hand growled, but he'd already released Harriet's arm. "When a man bothers a lady on a public street, it becomes everybody's business," the stranger replied evenly. One hand rested casually near his holstered pistol, not a threat but a reminder. The cowboys exchanged glances, apparently deciding this wasn't worth a fight. They shuffled away, muttering curses under their breath. Harriet stood frozen, staring at her unexpected defender. "You all right, miss?" He tipped his hat, and she caught her first clear look at Flynn Garrett's face, handsome indeed, with features that seemed carved from the Colorado mountains themselves, but with a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted his dangerous stance. "Yes, thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were just being foolish." "Men who disrespect women are worse than foolish," he said. "They're cowards." Their eyes met briefly, and Harriet felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Then she quickly looked down again, convinced a man like him would only be kind out of pity. "Can I walk you to where you're going?" he offered. "It's not necessary. I'm just headed to the mercantile. My uncle owns it." "Turner's Mercantile." "I was planning to stop there anyway. Need supplies." He fell into step beside her, shortening his stride to match hers. As they walked, Harriet stole glances at him from beneath her lashes. He was unlike any cowboy she'd seen before. There was a quietness about him, a sense of contained strength rather than brash showmanship. "I'm Flynn Garrett," he said after a moment of silence. "Just rode in from a drive up from Texas." "Harriet Turner," she replied softly, "though I suppose you heard that already." "Those men, do they bother you often?" Harriet shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. "People here have known me since I was a child. They don't mean any real harm." Flynn's expression darkened. "Sounds like harm to me." They reached the mercantile and Harriet paused at the door. "Thank you again, Mr. Garrett." "Flynn," he corrected with a small smile that transformed his serious face. "Just Flynn." "Flynn," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "Good evening." She slipped inside, heart pounding inexplicably, knowing he would soon be moving on like all the other drifters who passed through Stillwater Springs. Men like Flynn Garrett didn't stay, especially not for plain, bookish girls whom the town had already dismissed as unmarriageable. What Harriet didn't see was how Flynn stood outside the mercantile for a long moment, looking thoughtfully at the door through which she'd disappeared, struck by something he couldn't quite name in those intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. The next morning found Flynn at Turner's Mercantile earlier than he'd planned. He told himself it was because he needed to get supplies and move on, not because he was hoping to see the quiet girl from yesterday again. The bell jangled as he entered, and he found himself face to face with a stout, balding man arranging sacks of flour. "Good morning. Anything I can help you with?" the man asked. "Just picking up some trail supplies," Flynn replied, scanning the store. His eyes stopped when he spotted Harriet in the back corner, carefully counting items on a high shelf, balanced precariously on a wooden stool. "You must be Mr. Turner," Flynn added, turning his attention back to the shopkeeper. "Indeed I am. You're new in town, I take it." "Just passing through. Name's Flynn Garrett." As they spoke, Flynn noticed the stool beneath Harriet wobble. Without thinking, he moved quickly across the store just as she lost her balance. His hands found her waist, steadying her before she could fall. For a breathless moment, they were close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent in her hair. "Careful there," he murmured, helping her safely down. "Oh," Harriet's cheeks flushed crimson as she realized who had caught her. "Mr. Garrett, thank you." Flynn reluctantly stepped back, aware of Mr. Turner watching them with raised eyebrows. "You two acquainted?" her uncle asked. "Mr. Garrett helped me yesterday when some of the rocking hands were being difficult," Harriet explained, adjusting her spectacles nervously. Turner frowned. "Those boys bothering you again?" "I should have a word with their foreman." "It was nothing, Uncle Henry," she assured him quickly. "I can handle their teasing." Flynn noticed how she minimized the incident, how she seemed to accept the treatment as her due. It bothered him more than it should for someone who was just passing through. "Miss Turner was helping me with my supply list," Flynn said suddenly, surprising himself with the lie. "I need provisions for about a week's ride." "Harriet can certainly help you with that," Turner nodded, apparently satisfied. "I need to check on a delivery in the back. Holler if you need me." When her uncle disappeared into the storeroom, Harriet gave Flynn a quizzical look. "I wasn't helping you with a list." "You are now," he replied with a slight smile, pulling a crumpled paper from his pocket. "Unless you're too busy." "No, I can help." She took the paper, studying it with a seriousness that Flynn found oddly endearing. "Some of these items will be on the top shelves." "I'll get the ladder this time." As she gathered his supplies, Flynn found himself watching her movements, economical and graceful, despite her obvious self-consciousness. There was something about Harriet Turner that didn't fit with the way those cowboys had treated her. Behind those spectacles were the most expressive eyes he'd ever seen, full of intelligence and an unexpected warmth. "You read a lot?" he asked, noticing how her eyes lit up when she passed the small section of books in the corner. "Too much according to most people," she answered with a small smile. "But yes, books are friends that never leave." Unlike people like me, Flynn thought, feeling an unexpected twinge of something like regret. "What are you reading now?" he found himself asking. Harriet looked surprised by his continued interest. "Emerson's Essays, and a novel by Miss Austen." "Never read either," Flynn admitted. "My education wasn't much to speak of." "You can read, though. Enough to get by." "Signs, contracts, wanted posters," he added with a wry smile. Harriet finished gathering his supplies, efficiently wrapping the food items in brown paper. "That should last you a week on the trail. Where are you headed?" Flynn hesitated. He hadn't actually decided yet, had only known he'd be moving on as he always did. North maybe, heard there might be work in Wyoming. "Wyoming is beautiful, I'm told," she said softly. "Though I've never been farther than Denver myself." Their conversation was interrupted when the bell over the door jangled, and three well-dressed women entered, immediately falling silent when they spotted Harriet with Flynn. He didn't miss how Harriet seemed to shrink into herself under their scrutinizing gazes. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Cole, Miss Cole." Harriet greeted them politely. The oldest woman offered a tight smile. "Harriet, I see you're assisting this gentleman." The way she said "gentleman" made it clear she thought Flynn was anything, but he was used to such treatment. Cowboys weren't considered respectable company in many circles. "Mr. Garrett is just passing through," Harriet explained, and Flynn didn't miss the slight emphasis on passing through, as if reminding herself as much as informing the women. "How fortunate for our little town," the younger woman, Miss Cole, said with a predatory smile directed at Flynn. "Will you be attending the spring social this Saturday, Mr. Garrett? We always welcome new faces." Before Flynn could decline, Mr. Turner emerged from the back room. "Mrs. Peterson, your special order arrived yesterday. Harriet, would you finish up with Mr. Garrett while I help the ladies?" Left alone again, Harriet quickly totaled his purchases. "That will be $3.42, she said, not meeting his eyes. Flynn placed the money on the counter, deliberately including an extra $half. When she noticed and tried to return it, he shook his head. "For your help," he insisted, "and for recommending a book." "I didn't recommend anything," she said, confused. "You will now," Flynn replied. "Something not too difficult for a man who mostly reads wanted posters." A genuine smile transformed Harriet's face, reaching all the way to her eyes, and Flynn felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. For the first time, he saw beyond the plain clothing and severe hairstyle to something luminous beneath. "In that case," she said with newfound confidence, "I would suggest The Last of the Mohicans. It has adventure but also," she hesitated, heart. Flynn nodded, committing the title to memory. "I'll look for it, thank you, Miss Turner." "Harriet," she corrected softly, echoing his words from the previous day. "Just Harriet." "Harriet," he repeated, tipping his hat before gathering his packages. "Much obliged." As he stepped outside into the morning sunshine, Flynn Garrett realized he was in no particular hurry to leave Stillwater Springs after all. Perhaps he could stay a few days, rest his horse, maybe even find that book. The trail north would still be there next week. What he didn't acknowledge, even to himself, was that it wasn't the town that suddenly interested him, but the quiet girl with intelligent eyes who had just smiled at him as though he were worthy of far more than just passing through. Over the next 3 days, Flynn found increasingly transparent excuses to visit the mercantile. Each time, he was rewarded with Harriet's shy smile, which seemed to grow more confident with each encounter. Their conversations, initially stilted and brief, gradually lengthened as she emerged from her shell of self-protection. On his fourth day in town, Flynn was leaning against the counter, telling Harriet about a lightning storm he'd witnessed on the plains, when Mr. Turner approached with a thoughtful expression. "Garrett, you looking for work while you're in town?" he asked. Flynn straightened. "Could be, depends on the work. My delivery driver broke his leg yesterday. I need someone reliable to take the supply wagon up to the Patterson Ranch tomorrow. It's a day's journey there and back, pays $5. Flynn considered it. He'd been planning to move on soon, but $5 was good money, and another day in Stillwater Springs meant another day to see Harriet. The thought surprised him. When had he started measuring time by opportunities to talk with a quiet shop girl? "I can do that," Flynn agreed. "I know horses and wagons well enough." "Good. Be here at dawn," Turner nodded, then added with a shrewd look, "My niece will go along to inventory the delivery." Flynn caught the flicker of surprise on Harriet's face. "Uncle Henry, that's not necessary, I'm sure, Mr. Garrett." "The Pattersons ordered fabric for Mrs. Patterson's new dresses," Turner interrupted. "You need to measure her again, and I can't spare Martha from the shop, unless you object to the company, Garrett." "No objection here," Flynn replied, perhaps too quickly. The prospect of a day alone with Harriet both thrilled and unsettled him. What was happening to his determination to remain unattached? After Turner walked away, Harriet whispered, "You don't have to take me along. I know Uncle Henry is just being protective." "I'd welcome the company," Flynn assured her honestly, "and I've never been to the Patterson place. I'd likely get lost without a guide." Her answering smile was worth the admission that he, an experienced trail rider, might need directions. Dawn broke clear and cool the next morning, as Flynn loaded the last crate onto the wagon. Harriet appeared carrying a small basket, dressed in a practical blue calico dress with a matching bonnet. Without her usual wire spectacles, her face seemed softer, more vulnerable. "No spectacles today?" Flynn asked, helping her onto the wagon seat. "They give me headaches on long rides," she explained, settling her skirts. "I can see well enough without them for most things, just not for close work like sewing and reading." Flynn took his place beside her, suddenly very aware of how the narrow seat forced them to sit close together. He cleared his throat. "Your uncle gave me directions, but you'll tell me if I'm going wrong." "Of course," she nodded, her hands folded primly on her lap. As they left town, Flynn noticed several people watching their departure with undisguised interest. Two women outside the millinery shop whispered behind their hands, and Harriet's shoulders tensed beside him. "Don't pay them any mind," Flynn said quietly. "People talk no matter what you do." "They're wondering why Uncle Henry would send me alone with a strange cowboy," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "It's unusual." "Your uncle strikes me as a good judge of character," Flynn said, "and I've got a trustworthy face." That earned him a small laugh. "Do you? I hadn't noticed." The teasing note in her voice surprised and delighted him. As they left the town behind, traveling through rolling grasslands toward distant foothills, Harriet gradually relaxed. Their conversation flowed more easily than it had in the confines of the mercantile, touching on everything from the wildflowers they passed to Flynn's adventures driving cattle across the territories. "Have you always been a cowboy?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. Flynn helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering perhaps a moment too long at her waist. "Since I was 16. Before that, I worked my father's farm in Missouri." "What made you leave?" Flynn's expression darkened. He rarely spoke of his past, but something about Harriet's genuine interest made him willing to share pieces of it. "The war came through our valley. Father joined up with the Union, never came home. Mother tried to keep the farm going, but she took sick the winter of '75. After she passed, there wasn't much to stay for." He skipped over the worst parts, the raiders who'd burned neighboring farms, the nights he'd stood guard with his father's old rifle, the crushing loneliness after his mother's death. "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly. "My parents died of fever when I was 12. That's when I came to live with Uncle Henry and Aunt Martha." "Must have been hard, losing them so young." She nodded, looking out over the stream. "It was. But I was fortunate to have family who took me in, even if I was a burden." "A burden?" Flynn frowned. "You work harder than anyone I've seen in that store." "Now, yes, but when I first arrived, I was just another mouth to feed." A plain, bookish girl with few prospects for marriage, not exactly what anyone hopes for in a niece. The matter-of-fact way she described herself made Flynn's chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. "Who told you that you were plain?" Harriet looked at him in surprise. "No one needed to tell me. I have mirrors, Mr. Garrett." "Flynn," he corrected automatically, "and those mirrors must be broken." A flush crept up her neck to her cheeks. "You needn't say such things out of kindness." "I'm not a kind man, Harriet," Flynn replied seriously. "Ask anyone who's ridden with me. I'm practical, sometimes harsh. I don't say things I don't mean." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, neither spoke. Then a meadowlark called nearby, breaking the spell. Harriet turned away first, moving back toward the wagon. "We should continue if we want to reach the Patterson Ranch by midday," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Flynn helped her back onto the seat, more confused by his own feelings than he had been in years. He was a drifter, a man who never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments. Yet here he was, wanting nothing more than to convince this woman of her own worth, a worth that seemed blindingly obvious to him, if not to her or the town that had labeled her their ugly duckling. As the wagon rolled onward, Flynn found himself speaking more openly than he had with anyone in years, telling Harriet about the stars he'd learned to navigate by, the books he wished he'd read, the places he'd seen in his travels. In turn, she shared her dreams of someday seeing the ocean, of writing stories instead of just reading them, of finding a place where she might be valued for her mind rather than dismissed for her appearance. "Why do you stay in Stillwater Springs?" he asked as they approached the Patterson Ranch, visible as a collection of buildings in the distance. "You could go to Denver, or even back east where they have women's colleges now." Harriet sighed. "It takes money to leave, Flynn, and courage. I have little of either." "You're one of the bravest people I've met," he countered, "and as for money, that can be earned." She gave him a sad smile. "Perhaps someday. For now, I have responsibilities to my aunt and uncle. They did take me in when they didn't have to." Flynn wanted to argue further, but held his tongue as they pulled up to the ranch house. He helped Harriet down, his hands spanning her narrow waist, and was rewarded with a soft "thank you" and another blush that made him wonder what it would be like to see that color in her cheeks for entirely different reasons. The Pattersons welcomed them warmly, particularly Harriet, whom they clearly knew well. While she conducted her measurements and inventory with Mrs. Patterson, Flynn helped unload the supplies with the ranch hands. When they finished, he found himself in conversation with Mr. Patterson, an older man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. "You're new around these parts," Patterson observed, "just passing through." "Something like that," Flynn replied noncommittally. Patterson nodded toward where Harriet could be seen through the window, carefully writing in a small notebook. "Henry Turner's a good man to work for, protective of his niece, though." Flynn felt himself being assessed, and met the older man's gaze steadily. "As he should be." Indeed, girls had a hard time of it in that town, too smart for her own good, and folks don't know what to make of her. Patterson stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Shame how they treat her. Worth 10 of those giggling girls who do nothing but chase husbands and gossip." Flynn found himself nodding in agreement before he could stop himself. She deserves better than what that town thinks of her. Patterson's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Does she now, and what would a drifting cowboy know about what Miss Turner deserves?" The question hit uncomfortably close to Flynn's own doubts. What did he know? He was just passing through, after all. Yet something rebellious rose in him at the suggestion that his transient lifestyle made his observations less valid. "I know enough to see what's in front of me," Flynn said firmly. "And that's a woman of intelligence and character being judged unfairly." Patterson studied him a moment longer, then nodded as if satisfied by what he saw. "Well said, young man." "Well said indeed." The sun was already starting its westward descent when they finally began the journey back to town. Harriet seemed pleased with her work at the ranch, chatting more freely than she had on the outward journey. Flynn found himself cataloging the ways her face changed when she was relaxed, how her eyes caught the light, how a small dimple appeared in her left cheek when she smiled fully. They were about an hour from town when dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Flynn eyed them warily. "Looks like a storm's coming in," he observed. "We might get caught in it before we make it back." Harriet looked concerned. There's an old line shack about a half-mile off the road just ahead. The Turners use it sometimes when traveling between ranches. We could wait out the worst there if necessary." Flynn nodded, pushing the horses to a faster pace. The wind picked up, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. By the time they reached the turnoff Harriet indicated, fat drops were already beginning to fall, and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small covered porch, but it offered shelter from the storm that was now breaking in earnest. Flynn quickly unhitched the horses and led them to a lean-to beside the cabin, while Harriet unlocked the door with a key she produced from her pocket. By the time Flynn got inside, he was soaked to the skin, and rain was coming down in sheets outside the small windows. Harriet had already lit a lantern she found on a shelf and was busy examining the cabin's sparse contents. "There's some dry firewood," she reported, gesturing to a stack beside a small stone fireplace, "and some basic provisions. We should be comfortable enough until the storm passes." Flynn set about building a fire, aware that the temperature was dropping with the rain. As the flames caught and began to warm the small space, he became acutely conscious of their situation, alone together in an isolated cabin, with night approaching and the storm showing no signs of abating. "Your uncle will be worried," he said, removing his wet coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Harriet nodded, untying her damp bonnet. "He knows about this place. If we don't return by dark, he'll assume we've taken shelter here." "Will he come looking for you?" Flynn asked, uncertain whether to hope for rescue or more time alone with Harriet. "Not in this weather," she replied, moving closer to the fire and extending her hands toward its warmth. "The road gets treacherous when wet. He'd expect us to stay put until morning." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. A night alone, unchaperoned, would be scandalous by any frontier standard. Yet neither of them had any choice. The storm outside was now a full-fledged downpour, with lightning flashing and thunder crashing overhead. "I can sleep on the porch if it would make you more comfortable," Flynn offered, though the thought of spending the night in the wet cold held little appeal. Harriet looked genuinely surprised. "That's not necessary. You'd catch your death out there." She gestured to the small cabin's simple furnishings, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and little else. "We're adults, Mr. Garrett. I trust you as a gentleman, and we have a perfectly good fire to sit by all night." Flynn felt a rush of gratitude for her practical nature, even as he registered the return to the more formal Mr. Garrett now that they were in this compromising situation. "Still, Flynn," he reminded her gently, "and thank you for your trust, it won't be misplaced." As the evening progressed, they made a simple meal from the provisions in the cabin: beans, jerky, and hardtack softened in coffee they brewed over the fire. The storm continued unabated outside, but inside, the atmosphere grew increasingly comfortable as they talked by firelight. Harriet sat on the edge of the bed while Flynn took one of the wooden chairs, maintaining a respectful distance between them. She had removed her damp outer clothing to dry near the fire, leaving her in her simple dress with her long brown hair loose around her shoulders. Without her spectacles and with her hair down, she looked younger, softer, and startlingly beautiful in the golden firelight. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Flynn said impulsively as they finished their makeshift dinner. Harriet considered the request, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I sometimes wish I could just leave everything behind and start over somewhere no one knows me, somewhere I could be someone else entirely." "Who would you be?" Flynn asked, genuinely curious. "Someone brave," she answered immediately. "Someone who doesn't care what others think, someone who takes chances." She looked down at her hands, not the town's pitiful spinster in training. Flynn frowned. "Is that how you see yourself?" "It's how everyone sees me," she replied with a small shrug. "The plain, odd girl who reads too much and will likely end up caring for her aunt and uncle in their old age because no man would want her." "That's not how I see you," Flynn said quietly. Harriet looked up, her eyes wide and vulnerable in the firelight. "How do you see me then?" Flynn hesitated, knowing he was approaching dangerous territory. He was leaving soon, had always been leaving soon. Getting involved would only hurt her in the end, and yet he couldn't bear the thought of her continuing to believe what the town had convinced her of. "I see a woman of extraordinary intelligence trapped in a place too small to appreciate her," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I see someone who notices everything, the way the light changes before a storm, the exact shade of wildflowers by the stream. I see kindness in how you speak to everyone, even those who have been cruel to you." "I see," he paused, then finished simply, "beauty." The last word hung between them in the quiet cabin, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. Harriet's face registered shock, then disbelief, then a cautious, fragile hope that made Flynn's chest ache. "You shouldn't say such things if you don't mean them," she whispered. "I told you before I don't say things I don't mean." Flynn stood, moving to sit beside her on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a proper distance. "The problem isn't with your mirrors, Harriet. It's with the eyes of people who don't truly see you." Harriet's gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting nervously in her lap. "Even if what you say were true, and I'm not convinced it is, you'll be gone soon, back to your life on the trail. What difference does it make how you see me when everyone else will still see the same plain, awkward girl?" The question hit Flynn like a physical blow because she was right. He was leaving, had always been leaving. His life was the open trail, sleeping under stars, moving on before connections could form. That was the choice he'd made years ago, the safety he'd constructed for himself in a dangerous world. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got people killed out west. Yet sitting here in this small cabin, with this remarkable woman beside him, Flynn Garrett suddenly found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his chosen path. "Maybe what matters," he said slowly, "is how you see yourself." Harriet looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "And how am I supposed to do that when every day I'm reminded of all the ways I don't measure up?" "By trusting what you know to be true about yourself," Flynn said, reaching out tentatively to take one of her hands in his. "By believing that there are people who see your worth, even if they're just passing through." Her fingers trembled slightly in his, but she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire washing over them as the storm raged outside. Flynn was intensely aware of every point of contact between them, his rough, calloused hand engulfing her smaller, softer one, their shoulders almost but not quite touching, the faint scent of lavender from her hair. "Your turn," Harriet finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." Flynn stared into the flames, considering what truth he was willing to share. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I'm tired of leaving," he admitted. 8 years of never staying anywhere long enough to be more than a hired hand, a familiar face at a saloon for a week or two. "I tell myself it's freedom, but sometimes," he paused, swallowing hard, "sometimes it feels like running." "What are you running from?" Harriet asked gently. Flynn shook his head. "Not from just running. If you never stop moving, you never have to face what might happen if you stayed." "And what might happen if you stayed?" Her question was soft but direct, her eyes searching his face. Flynn looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet her gaze. "I might discover that everything I thought I wanted, the open trail, the freedom to leave, wasn't what I needed at all." The air between them seemed to charge with unspoken possibilities. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, the thunder now distant, the rain softer against the roof. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing as Flynn found himself leaning almost imperceptibly closer to Harriet. "Flynn," she whispered, his name a question on her lips. "I should check on the horses," he said suddenly, breaking the moment and rising to his feet. Self-preservation kicked in, he was getting too close, feeling too much. This wasn't the plan. It had never been the plan. Harriet nodded, a flash of hurt crossing her features before she composed herself. "Of course you should." Flynn stepped outside onto the covered porch, gulping in the cool, rain-washed air. The horses were fine under their lean-to, but he needed the moment to clear his head. What was he doing? Harriet Turner deserved someone who could stay, who could show the whole town how wrong they'd been about her, who could build a life with her. Not a drifter who'd be gone with the next herd or the first sign of trouble. When he returned inside, Harriet had made up the bed with fresh linens she'd found in a trunk. "You should take the bed," she said formally. "I can sleep in the chair by the fire." "Absolutely not," Flynn replied. "I'll take the floor." "You get the bed." They argued briefly, with Flynn ultimately prevailing. As he made a pallet of blankets near the fire, he was acutely aware of Harriet settling into the narrow bed across the room, her back to him as she pulled the quilt up to her shoulders. "Good night, Flynn," she said softly. "Good night, Harriet," he replied, staring up at the rafters, feeling as though something important had just slipped through his fingers, though he couldn't say exactly what. Morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong. Flynn woke at first light to find Harriet already up, her hair neatly braided again, heating coffee over the rekindled fire. They spoke little as they prepared to return to town, both aware that something had shifted between them during the night, but neither ready to acknowledge it. The road back to Stillwater Springs was muddy but passable. As they approached the town, Flynn felt a growing sense of dread. He knew the gossip that would follow their overnight absence, knew how it might affect Harriet's already precarious standing in the community. "Let me do the talking when we get back," he said as the first buildings came into view. "I'll make it clear that everything was proper." Harriet gave him a small, sad smile. "It won't matter what you say, Flynn. People will believe what they want to believe." "Then I'll make them believe differently," he insisted, an unfamiliar protective instinct rising in him, but Harriet was right. As they pulled the wagon into town, people stopped to stare and whisper. By the time they reached the mercantile, a small crowd had gathered, including Harriet's aunt and uncle, who rushed out to meet them. "Where have you been, Mrs. Turner?" demanded, her face pinched with worry. "We were about to send a search party." "The storm caught us on the way back," Harriet explained calmly. "We took shelter in the line shack as you taught me to do, Uncle Henry." Turner's eyes moved from his niece to Flynn, assessing. "You spent the night there, alone?" "Yes, sir," Flynn replied firmly, "but I give you my word as a gentleman that nothing improper occurred. Miss Turner was perfectly safe in my company." The whispers around them grew louder. Flynn caught fragments, compromised, ruined, always knew she was desperate, and felt a surge of anger. How quickly they turned on her, how eager they were to believe the worst. "I believe you, son," Turner said after a long moment. "But not everyone will. You know how things work in small towns." Flynn did know. He'd seen it before, reputations destroyed by less, lives uprooted by gossip and innuendo. And suddenly he was furious, at the town, at himself, at the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Then I'd like your permission to call on your niece properly, Mr. Turner," Flynn heard himself say, the words coming before he'd fully formed the thought. "Starting this evening, if that would be acceptable." Harriet's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Around them, the whispers stopped abruptly. Turner studied Flynn with narrowed eyes. "You planning to stay in town then, Garrett? I was under the impression you were just passing through." It was the question Flynn had been asking himself all night as he lay on the hard floor, listening to Harriet's soft breathing across the room. Was he staying? Could he stay? Everything in him that had kept moving for 8 years screamed that this was a mistake, that putting down roots only gave life more ways to hurt you. But then he looked at Harriet, saw the confusion and cautious hope in her eyes, and knew he couldn't leave. Not yet, not without at least exploring whatever this was between them. "I'm considering it, sir," Flynn replied honestly. "I've had enough of the trail for a while. Might be time to see what it's like to stay somewhere." Turner exchanged a look with his wife, then nodded slowly. 7 o'clock, we'll expect you for supper." The crowd began to disperse, though Flynn knew the gossip was only beginning. He helped unload the remainder of the supplies from the wagon, aware of Harriet's questioning glances, but unable to address them with so many eyes still on them. Finally, as he prepared to leave, she approached him by the wagon. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know you were just trying to protect my reputation." "You don't need to continue the charade." Flynn looked down at her earnest face. "Is that what you think this is, a charade?" "Isn't it?" she challenged. "You're a man who never stays, Flynn. You told me so yourself." "Maybe I'm tired of leaving," he replied, echoing his words from the night before. "Maybe I've found a reason to see what staying feels like." Harriet shook her head, disbelief evident in her expression. "Don't make promises you can't keep, not to me." Before Flynn could respond, she turned and walked into the store, leaving him standing alone by the wagon, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or perhaps the first right decision in 8 years of running. By the time Flynn arrived for dinner that evening, freshly bathed and wearing his cleanest shirt, it seemed the entire town knew of his intention to court Harriet Turner. The looks he received as he walked to the Turners' house ranged from curious to openly hostile. Clearly, many believed he was merely fulfilling an obligation created by their compromising situation. What none of them knew, what Flynn himself was only beginning to understand, was that the night in the cabin had simply crystallized feelings that had been growing since he first saw Harriet being harassed on the street. There was something about her quiet dignity, her hidden strength, that called to him in ways no woman ever had before. Dinner was a somewhat tense affair, with Mrs. Turner asking pointed questions about Flynn's background, prospects, and intentions. He answered honestly, making no promises he couldn't keep, but expressing his genuine interest in getting to know Harriet better. "And how long do you plan to stay in Stillwater Springs, Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Turner asked as they finished their dessert. "I'm not sure," Flynn admitted. "I've taken a room at the boarding house for now. Mr. Patterson offered me work at his ranch if I want it." "Steady work is important for a man," Turner commented. "Especially one with future responsibilities." The implication was clear. If Flynn was serious about Harriet, he needed to demonstrate that he could provide stability. After dinner, they were permitted to sit together on the porch under Mrs. Turner's watchful eye through the window. It was hardly private, but it was their first real chance to speak since the morning. "You didn't have to do this," Harriet said immediately, her hands fidgeting with her skirt. "I know you felt obligated after what happened." "Harriet, look at me," Flynn said softly, waiting until she raised her eyes to his. "I'm not here out of obligation. I'm here because I want to be." "But you'll leave eventually," she insisted. "That's who you are, you told me yourself." "Maybe that's who I was," Flynn conceded. "I don't know who I am now, to be honest. I just know that the thought of riding out of town, without seeing where this might lead, feels wrong." Harriet studied his face in the fading light, searching for deception and finding none. "I don't want your pity, Flynn." "Pity?" He nearly laughed at the absurdity. "Harriet, the last thing I feel for you is pity. Admiration, yes. Respect, absolutely. And something else I'm not sure I'm ready to name yet, but never pity." A blush rose in her cheeks, visible even in the dim porch light. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. "No one has ever courted me before." Flynn smiled. "Well, I've never courted anyone before, so we're even. We'll figure it out together." For the first time that evening, Harriet returned his smile, and Flynn felt something shift and settle in his chest, a certainty that whatever came next, this moment was right. The weeks that followed were a revelation for both of them. Flynn took the job at the Patterson Ranch but rode into town every evening to call on Harriet. They walked together along the town's quiet streets, sat on the porch swing talking for hours, and gradually discovered the joy of simply being in each other's company. Flynn found work came easily to him at the ranch. Years of trail riding had made him skilled with horses and cattle, and Patterson seemed pleased with his efforts. For the first time since leaving his father's farm, Flynn felt the satisfaction of working the same piece of land day after day, of seeing the results of his labor take tangible form. Harriet, meanwhile, blossomed under Flynn's attention. She began to hold her head higher when they walked through town, to speak more confidently in conversations. She even stood up to one of the women who made a snide remark about her catching a husband through scandal. "My relationship with Mr. Garrett is not up for public discussion, Mrs. Cole," Harriet had said firmly, "but I would suggest that your time might be better spent on your own affairs rather than mine." Flynn had nearly burst with pride when she recounted the incident to him later. The town's attitude was slow to change, but change it did. Some, like the Pattersons, were openly supportive of their courtship. Others maintained a wait-and-see approach, clearly expecting Flynn to leave at the first opportunity. A few, particularly the mothers of eligible daughters who had set their sights on the handsome newcomer, remained openly hostile. None of it seemed to matter when they were together. Flynn found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd never voiced to another soul, about his parents, the war that had taken his father, the years of drifting that had followed. In turn, Harriet revealed her dreams of writing stories, of seeing more of the world than just Colorado territory, of being valued for more than her appearance or marriage prospects. One evening, about a month into their courtship, Flynn brought Harriet a gift, a book he'd found in the next town over during a supply run for the ranch. "The Last of the Mohicans," Harriet read the title with delight. "You remembered." "I've been reading it myself," Flynn admitted. "Slowly, but I'm getting through it. I thought we could talk about it together." The joy in her face at such a simple gesture made Flynn's heart swell. They sat on the porch swing, heads bent together as Harriet showed him a particularly moving passage she loved. Flynn was more captivated by the animation in her features than the words on the page, but he listened intently, asking questions that revealed he'd been paying attention to the story. "You're full of surprises, Flynn Garrett," Harriet said, looking up at him with a warmth that made his breath catch. "So are you," he replied softly, then, glancing to make sure Mrs. Turner wasn't watching too closely through the window, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Harriet's lips. It was brief, chaste even, but when he pulled back, the wonder in her eyes told him it had been her first kiss. The trust implied in that realization humbled him. "I should apologize," he began, "but I'm not sorry at all." Harriet's laugh was soft and breathless. "Neither am I." As summer turned to early fall, Flynn's presence in Stillwater Springs became an accepted fact rather than a temporary curiosity. He attended church with the Turners on Sundays, participated in community gatherings, and gradually earned the respect of many who had initially viewed him with suspicion. His relationship with Harriet deepened, built on genuine affection and growing understanding. Yet beneath it all, Flynn harbored a secret fear that he couldn't quite shake, the fear that someday the restlessness would return, that the open trail would call to him again, that he would revert to the man who couldn't stay. He made no promises to Harriet beyond the present, and she'd asked for none, seeming to accept the uncertainty of their future with a quiet grace that sometimes broke his heart. The annual harvest dance in early October became a turning point neither of them anticipated. The whole town gathered in the decorated town hall, with musicians playing lively tunes as couples swirled across the floor. Flynn and Harriet arrived together, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm. For the occasion, Harriet had made herself a new dress of deep blue fabric that brought out the richness of her brown eyes. She'd styled her hair differently too, with soft tendrils framing her face rather than the severe braids she typically wore. When Flynn first saw her, he'd been momentarily speechless, finally managing to tell her that she looked beautiful. "It's just a dress, Flynn," she'd replied with characteristic modesty, though the pleasure in her eyes told him his words meant something to her. At the dance, Flynn noticed the changing attitudes of the townspeople firsthand. Several men who had previously ignored or even mocked Harriet now approached to request dances, only to be politely informed that her card was full, a small fiction Flynn had suggested to spare her any unwanted attention. "It seems your stock has risen considerably, Miss Turner," Flynn teased as they waltzed together, his hand warm at her waist. "Only because I'm on your arm," she replied, but without the self-deprecation that would have colored such a statement months earlier. "They're curious about what you see in me." "Let them wonder," Flynn said. "Some treasures aren't meant to be obvious to everyone." As the evening progressed, Flynn excused himself briefly to get Harriet some punch. While waiting his turn at the refreshment table, he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. "I'll grant you the Turner girl does look almost pretty tonight," Mrs. Cole was saying to another woman. "Amazing what a decent dress and a man's attention can do for even the plainest face." "Do you think he'll actually marry her?" the other woman asked. "Most folks still believe he'll move on once the novelty wears off." "Cowboys aren't known for settling down." "Of course he won't," Mrs. Cole replied with certainty. "Men like that don't marry girls like Harriet Turner. He's just passing the time until something better comes along or the trail calls him back. Poor girl will be more of a laughingstock than ever when he leaves." Flynn's hand tightened around the empty punch cup, nearly crushing it. The worst part was that he couldn't honestly refute them, not completely. Wasn't that same fear lurking in his own heart, that someday he'd revert to the man he'd been, the man who never stayed? He returned to Harriet with the punch, forcing a smile he didn't feel. She saw through it immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked as they moved to a quieter corner of the hall. "Nothing," Flynn lied, then immediately regretted it. Harriet deserved better than half-truths. "Just overheard some unkind gossip." "About me?" she asked, her expression resigned but not surprised. "About us," Flynn corrected. "About my intentions." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Ah. The prediction that you'll eventually leave." The fact that she could state it so calmly, without accusation, only increased Flynn's turmoil. "Doesn't it bother you that they talk about us that way?" Harriet considered the question seriously. "It bothers me that they underestimate you," she finally said. "As for their predictions about our future, I've never asked you for promises, Flynn." "Maybe you should," he said, more forcefully than he intended. Harriet shook her head. "I don't want promises made because of town gossip or wounded pride. Whatever happens between us should be because it's what we both truly want." Her wisdom humbled him. In that moment, looking at this remarkable woman who had found the strength to hope without demanding guarantees, Flynn Garrett realized something that shook him to his core. He was in love with Harriet Turner. Completely, irrevocably in love with her intelligence, her quiet courage, her compassion. And the thought of leaving her, of returning to his solitary existence on the trail, was suddenly unbearable. "Dance with me," he said abruptly, setting aside their punch cups and leading her back to the floor as the musicians began a slow waltz. As they moved together, Flynn held her closer than propriety strictly allowed, his cheek nearly touching her hair. "Harriet," he said softly, "what if I told you I don't want to leave? Not now, not ever." She missed a step, her eyes flying up to his face. "I'd say you shouldn't make declarations in the heat of a moment." "This isn't about the gossip," Flynn insisted. "It's about what I've been feeling for weeks but was too afraid to admit, even to myself." The music continued around them, but they had nearly stopped moving, standing close together in their own private world amidst the swirling couples. "And what is that?" Harriet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I love you," Flynn said simply. "That for the first time in my life, staying in one place doesn't feel like being trapped, it feels like coming home. That the thought of riding away from you is more painful than any hardship I faced on the trail." Tears glistened in Harriet's eyes, catching the light from the lanterns overhead. "Flynn." Whatever she might have said was interrupted as the music ended and couples around them began to applaud. The moment broken, they moved off the dance floor. Flynn guided Harriet toward the doors leading to the small garden behind the town hall, needing privacy for what he wanted to say next. In the cool October air, with only the muted sounds of music and laughter from inside reaching them, Flynn took both of Harriet's hands in his. "I love you," he repeated, the words coming easier the second time. "And I know that must be hard to believe, given my history, but I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." "I believe you," Harriet said softly. "I believe you mean it now, but Flynn, love doesn't erase who we are. You've spent years never staying in one place. How can you be sure that won't change?" It was the question Flynn had been asking himself for weeks. How could he be sure? He'd never made a promise like this before, never wanted to, until now. "Because every day I wake up I choose to stay," he said after a long moment. "And every day that choice gets easier, not harder, because when I think about the future, something I never used to do, I can't picture it without you in it." Harriet's eyes searched his face in the dim light spilling from the town hall windows. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have almost from the beginning, though I told myself it was foolish." Flynn's heart soared at her words. He drew her closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Harriet Turner, I don't just want to stay in Stillwater Springs. I want to build a life here with you. If you'll have me." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Harriet's voice trembled slightly. Instead of answering immediately, Flynn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight, a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. "I bought this in Denver last week," he admitted. "I've been carrying it around, trying to find the perfect moment, trying to convince myself I had the right to ask." He took a deep breath. "Harriet, will you marry me?" For a long, heart-stopping moment, Harriet simply stared at the ring. Then she raised her eyes to his, tears spilling freely now. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, Flynn, I will marry you." Flynn slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I can't offer you much," he said honestly. "I've saved some from my work at Patterson's, but—" "I don't need much," Harriet interrupted. "Just you. Just this chance at happiness neither of us thought we deserved." They returned to the dance with Harriet's hand proudly displaying the pearl ring. The news spread quickly through the hall, met with reactions ranging from genuine congratulations to poorly concealed surprise. Mr. and Mrs. Turner gave their blessing, though Flynn could see the lingering concern in Mrs. Turner's eyes, the fear that he might still break her niece's heart. "I won't let her down," Flynn promised the older woman quietly as they spoke after the announcement. "I know my word doesn't mean much to you yet, but I intend to prove it with actions." Mrs. Turner's expression softened slightly. "See that you do, Mr. Garrett. That girl deserves every happiness after all she's endured." The weeks following their engagement were a whirlwind of planning and preparations. Flynn continued working at the Patterson ranch, saving every penny he could. Mr. Patterson, upon hearing of the engagement, offered Flynn a permanent position as his foreman with a small cabin on the property for him and his future bride. "You've got a good head for the business," Patterson told him. "And I've never seen Harriet Turner so happy. Seems to me you both deserve a chance at building something lasting." Harriet, meanwhile, began creating her own wedding dress, working on it during evenings after the dress shop closed. She refused to let Flynn see it, insisting on maintaining at least one traditional surprise for their wedding day. The town's attitude continued its gradual shift. Those who had dismissed Harriet now acknowledged her with new respect. Those who had predicted Flynn's eventual departure now had to reckon with his obvious commitment. A few holdouts still whispered that it wouldn't last, but even they had to admit that the couple's happiness was evident to anyone who saw them together. As the December wedding date approached, Flynn found himself facing one final challenge to his newfound certainty. A cattle buyer from Wyoming passed through town, bringing news of high prices for trail hands willing to make the long drive north in the spring. The man approached Flynn directly, having heard of his experience. "I could use a man like you," the buyer said as they spoke outside the mercantile. "Pay would be double what you're making here, and there might be a permanent position at the end if you're interested." The old Flynn, the drifter, the man who never stayed, would have jumped at such an opportunity. Good money opened trails, new horizons. For a brief, disconcerting moment, he felt the familiar pull of the road, the promise of what lay beyond the next hill. Then he looked across the street and saw Harriet emerging from the dress shop, her face lighting up when she spotted him. In that moment, the choice that had seemed so impossible a few months ago was suddenly the easiest decision he'd ever made. "I appreciate the offer," Flynn told the buyer, "but I've got everything I need right here." The man followed his gaze to Harriet and nodded in understanding. Can't fault a man for choosing love over wandering. "Best of luck to you both." When Flynn told Harriet about the offer that evening as they sat together on her uncle's porch, she studied his face carefully. "You weren't tempted, even a little?" she asked. "I won't lie to you," Flynn replied, taking her hand. "There was a moment, just a moment, when I felt the old pull, but then I saw you and I realized something important." "What's that?" Harriet asked softly. "All those years I spent traveling, I was looking for something without knowing what it was," Flynn said. "A place that felt right, a purpose that made sense, a feeling of belonging. And I found it all here, not in Stillwater Springs itself, but in you, Harriet. You're my home now." The simple truth of his words hung in the air between them, more binding than any formal vow. Harriet's eyes filled with tears as she leaned forward to kiss him gently. "And you are mine," she whispered against his lips. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting long shadows across the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The small church was filled with well-wishers, the Pattersons, the Turners, and even many of the townspeople who had once dismissed Harriet or doubted Flynn's intentions. Flynn stood at the altar, dressed in a new suit bought specially for the occasion, his heart pounding with anticipation rather than the fear he might have expected. This wasn't the end of freedom, as he'd once believed marriage to be. It was the beginning of something far more precious, a shared journey with the woman who had helped him find his true self. When the church doors opened and Harriet appeared on her uncle's arm, Flynn forgot to breathe. Her wedding dress, crafted by her own skilled hands, was a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin that highlighted her slender figure. Her brown hair was arranged in soft curls beneath a lace veil, and she wore her wire-rimmed spectacles, a choice Flynn later learned she'd made deliberately, wanting to come to him as herself, not some transformed version of herself. To Flynn, she had never looked more beautiful, not because of the dress or the occasion, but because of the confidence with which she moved toward him, the love shining in her eyes as they met his. This was the woman who had seen beyond his drifter exterior to the man capable of commitment and love, the woman who had believed in him when he hadn't fully believed in himself. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, spoken clearly before the congregation. When Flynn slipped the gold band onto Harriet's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his conviction absolute. This was right. This was where he belonged. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Flynn lifted Harriet's veil and bent to claim his first kiss as her husband, a murmur of approval went through the church. The town's so-called ugly duckling had not only found love but had transformed before their eyes into a woman of confidence and joy, not because she had physically changed, but because she was finally seen for who she truly was by the man who loved her. The celebration afterward at the town hall was filled with music, laughter, and more genuine goodwill than either of them had expected. Even Mrs. Cole approached to offer congratulations, though her smile seemed somewhat forced. "You've surprised us all, Mr. Garrett," she said. "Not many would have seen what you apparently saw in our Harriet." Before Flynn could respond with what might have been a less than charitable remark, Harriet slipped her arm through his and smiled serenely at the older woman. "My husband has always been able to recognize true value, Mrs. Cole," Harriet said with quiet dignity. "It's one of his many admirable qualities." The pride in her voice when she said, "my husband," made Flynn's heart swell. He covered her hand with his, feeling the new ring on her finger. "I'm the fortunate one," he told Mrs. Cole, his eyes never leaving Harriet's face. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure my wife knows exactly how precious she is to me." As they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, Flynn held Harriet close, marveling at how completely his life had changed in the span of a few short months. From a drifter convinced that the frontier was no place for love, to a man with roots, purpose, and a future bright with possibility. "Happy," he murmured against her hair as they swayed to the music. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Harriet replied, looking up at him with eyes that reflected all the love in his own heart. "And you, no regrets about staying?" Flynn shook his head, smiling down at the woman who had become his world. "The only regret I could ever have would be missing this, missing us. Everything else was just preparation for finding you." Later that night, as they rode through the moonlit snow toward the cabin that would be their new home on the Patterson Ranch, Flynn thought about the journey that had led him here. 8 years of drifting had finally brought him to the one place, the one person that made him want to stay. The frontier hadn't tamed him, love had, and in that love he'd found not confinement but the truest freedom he'd ever known. As spring came to Colorado territory, Flynn and Harriet Garrett stood together on the porch of their small cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Flynn's arm was wrapped around his wife's waist, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Mr. Patterson offered to sell us that parcel of land near the creek," Flynn said quietly. "Says it would make a good place to build a proper house someday." Harriet looked up at him, her eyes bright with happiness behind her spectacles. "Our own land, Flynn, are you sure?" "Never been more sure of anything," he replied, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "Except maybe marrying you." In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on greening pastures. Inside their cabin, books lined shelves Flynn had built with his own hands, including a growing collection of volumes they read together in the evenings. On a small desk by the window sat Harriet's latest writing project, stories she'd finally found the courage to put on paper, encouraged by her husband's unwavering belief in her talents. The people of Stillwater Springs still marveled at the transformation of the quiet seamstress they'd once pitied and the drifting cowboy who had seen what they all had missed, the true beauty of Harriet Turner Garrett, which had been there all along, waiting for the right eyes to see it. Flynn Garrett, once convinced that the frontier was no place for love and attachment, had discovered the most important truth of all, that home wasn't a place but a person, and that in finding Harriet, he'd finally found where he belonged.